raid on its rich territory, afterwards sought to be excused, on the part of the chief authority of the state, by lies which every one in the country knew to be such, and laughed at an ever-increasing ochlocracy, and finally all the disastrous influence which this abnegation of justice in high quarters must have exercised on private morals. This specimen of a pure constitution on the obverse side of the planet says very little for republics in general, but still less for the imitations of it in Mexico, Guatemala, Colombia, and Peru. A peculiar disadvantage attaching to republics, and one that might not be looked for, is that in this form of government it must be more difficult for men of ability to attain high position and exercise direct political influence than in the case of monarchies. For always and everywhere and under all circumstances there is a conspiracy, or instinctive alliance, against such men on the part of all the stupid, the weak, and the commonplace. They look upon such men as their natural enemies, and they are firmly held together by a common fear of them. There is always a numerous host of the stupid and the weak, and in a republican constitution it is easy for them to suppress and exclude the men of ability, so that they may not be outflanked by them. They are 50 to 1, and here all have equal rights at the start. In a monarchy, on the other hand, this natural and universal league of the stupid against those who are possessed of intellectual advantages is a one-sided affair. It exists only from below, for in a monarchy talent and intelligence receive a natural advocacy and support from above. In the first place, the position of the monarch himself is much too high and too firm for him to stand in fear of any sort of competition. In the next place, he serves the state more by his will than by his intelligence, for no intelligence could ever be equal to all the demands that would in his case be made upon it. He is therefore compelled to be always availing himself of other men's intelligence. Seeing that his own interests are securely bound up with those of his country, that they are inseparable from them and one with them, he will naturally give the preference to the best men, because they are his most serviceable instruments, and he will bestow his favor upon them as soon, that is, as he can find them, which is not so difficult, if only an honest search be made. Just in the same way even ministers of state have too much advantage over rising politicians to need to regard them with jealousy, and accordingly for analogous reasons they are glad to single out distinguished men and set them to work, in order to make use of their powers for themselves. It is in this way that intelligence has always under a monarchical government a much better chance against its irreconcilable and ever-present foe, stupidity, and the advantage which it gains is very great. In general, the monarchical form of government is that which is natural to man, just as it is natural to bees and ants, to a flight of cranes, a herd of wandering elephants, a pack of wolves seeking prey in common, and many other animals, all of which place one of their number at the head of the business in hand. Every business in which men engage, if it is attended with danger, every campaign, every ship at sea must also be subject to the authority of one commander. Everywhere it is one will that must lead. Even the animal organism is constructed on a monarchical principle. It is the brain alone which guides and governs, and exercises the hegemony. Although heart, lungs, and stomach contribute much more to the continued existence of the whole body, these Philistines cannot on that account be allowed to guide and lead. That is a business which belongs solely to the brain. Government must proceed from one central point. Even the solar system is monarchical. On the other hand, a republic is as unnatural as it is unfavorable to the higher intellectual life and the arts and sciences. Accordingly we find that everywhere in the world, and at all times, nations, whether civilized or savage, or occupying a position between the two, are always under monarchical government. The rule of many, as Homer said, is not a good thing. Let there be one ruler, one king. How would it be possible that, everywhere and at all times, we should see many millions of people, nay, even hundreds of millions, become the willing and obedient subjects of one man, sometimes even one woman, and provisionally, even, of a child, unless there were a monarchical instinct in men which drove them to it as the form of government best suited to them? This arrangement is not the of reflection. Everywhere one man is king, and for the most part his dignity is hereditary. He is, as it were, the personification, the monogram, of the whole people, which attains an individuality in him. In this sense he can rightly say, "El état c'est moi." It is precisely for this reason that in Shakespeare's historical plays the kings of England and France mutually address each other as France and England, and the Duke of Austria goes by the name of his country. It is as though the kings regarded themselves as the incarnation of their nationalities. It is all in accordance with human nature, and for this very reason the hereditary monarch cannot separate his own welfare and that of his family from the welfare of his country, as, on the other hand, mostly happens when the monarch is elected, as, for instance, in the states of the Church. The Chinese can conceive of a monarchical government only; what a republic is they utterly fail to understand. In when a Dutch legation was in China in the year 1658, it was obliged to represent that the Prince of Orange was their king, as otherwise the Chinese would have been inclined to take Holland for a nest of pirates living without any lord or master. Stobaeus, in a chapter in his Florilegium, at the head of which he wrote that monarchy is best, collected the best of the passages in which the ancients explained the advantages of that form of government. In a word, republics are unnatural and artificial, they are the product of reflection. Hence it is that they occur only as rare exceptions in the whole history of the world. There were the small Greek republics, the Roman, and the Carthaginian, but they were all rendered possible by the fact that 5/6, perhaps even 7/8, of the population consisted of slaves. In the year 1840, even in the United States, there were 3 million slaves to a population of 16 millions. Then, again, the duration of the republics of antiquity, compared with that of monarchies, was very short. Republics are very easy to found, and very difficult to maintain, while with monarchies it is exactly the reverse. If it is utopian schemes that are wanted, I say this: the only solution of the problem would be a despotism of the wise and the noble, of the true aristocracy and the genuine nobility, brought about by the method of generation, that is, by the marriage of the noblest men with the cleverest and most intellectual women. This is my utopia, my republic of Plato. Constitutional kings are undoubtedly in much the same position as the gods of Epicurus, who sit upon high in undisturbed bliss and tranquility, and do not meddle with human affairs. Just now they are the fashion. In every German duodecimo principality a parody of the English constitution is set up, quite complete, from upper and lower houses down to the habeas corpus act and trial by jury. These institutions, which proceed from English character and English circumstances, and presuppose both, are natural and suitable to the English people. It is just as natural to the German people to be split up into a number of different stocks, under a similar number of ruling princes, with an emperor over them all, who maintains peace at home, and represents the unity of the state board. It is an arrangement which has proceeded from German character and German circumstances. I am of opinion that if Germany is not to meet with the same fate as Italy, it must restore the imperial crown, which was done away with by its archenemy, the first Napoleon, and it must restore it as effectively as possible. For German unity depends on it, and without the crown it will always be merely nominal, or precarious. But as we no longer live in the days of Gunther of Wartburg, when the choice of emperor was a serious business, the imperial crown ought to go alternately to Prussia and to Austria, for the life of the wearer. In any case, the absolute sovereignty of the small states is illusory. Napoleon I did for Germany what Otto the Great did for Italy, he divided it into small, independent states, on the principle divide et impera. The English show their great intelligence, amongst other ways, by clinging to their ancient institutions, customs, and usages, and by holding them sacred, even at the risk of carrying this tenacity too far, and making it ridiculous. They hold them sacred for the simple reason that those institutions and customs are not the invention of an idle head, but have grown up gradually by the force of circumstance and the wisdom of life itself, and are therefore suited to them as a nation. On the other hand, the German Michel allows himself to be persuaded by his schoolmaster that he must go about in an English dress coat, and that nothing else will do. Accordingly he has bullied his father into giving it to him, and with his awkward manners this ungainly creature presents in it a sufficiently ridiculous figure. But the dress coat will some day be too tight for him and incommode him. It will not be very long before he feels it in trial by jury. This institution arose in the most barbarous period of the Middle Ages, the times of Alfred the Great, when the ability to read and write exempted a man from the penalty of death. It is the worst of all criminal procedures. Instead of judges, well versed in law and of great experience, who have grown grey in daily unraveling the tricks and wiles of thieves, murderers, and rascals of all sorts, and so are well able to get at the bottom of things, it is gossiping tailors and tanners who sit in judgment. It is their coarse, crude, unpracticed, and awkward intelligence, incapable of any sustained attention, that is called upon to find out the truth from a tissue of lies and deceit. All the time, moreover, they are thinking of their cloth and their leather, and longing to be at home, and they have absolutely no clear notion at all of the distinction between probability and certainty. It is with this sort of a calculus of probabilities in their stupid heads that they confidently undertake to seal a man's doom. The same remark is applicable to them which Dr. Johnson made of a court-martial in which he had little confidence, summoned to decide a very important case. He said that perhaps there was not a member of it who, in the whole course of his life, had ever spent an hour by himself in balancing probabilities. Can anyone imagine that the tailor and the tanner would be impartial judges? Vhv hat. The vicious multitude impartial. As if partiality were not 10 times more to be feared from men of the same class as the accused than from judges who knew nothing of him personally, lived in another sphere altogether, were irremovable, and conscious of the dignity of their office. But to let a jury decide on crimes against the state and its head, or on misdemeanors of the press, is in a very real sense to set the fox to keep the geese. Everywhere and at all times there has been much discontent with governments, laws, and public regulations, for the most part, however, because men are always ready to make institutions responsible for the misery inseparable from human existence itself, which is, to speak mythically, the curse that was laid on Adam, and through him on the whole race. But never has that delusion been proclaimed in a more mendacious and impudent manner than by the demagogues of the jet set of the day we live in. As enemies of Christianity, they are, of course, optimists. To them the world is its own end and accordingly in itself, that is to say, in its own natural constitution, it is anged on the most excellent principles, and forms a regular habitation of bliss. The enormous and glaring evils of the world they attribute wholly to governments. If governments, they think, were to do their duty, there would be a heaven upon earth. In other words, all men could eat, drink, propagate and die, free from trouble and want. This is what they mean when they talk of the world being its own end and object. This is the goal of that perpetual progress of the human race, and the other fine things which they are never tired of proclaiming. Formerly it was faith which was the chief support of the throne, nowadays it is credit. The Pope himself is scarcely more concerned to retain the confidence of the faithful than to make his creditors believe in his own good faith. If in times past it was the guilty debt of the world which was lamented, now it is the financial debts of the world which arouse dismay. Formerly it was the last day which was prophesied, now it is the Greek, the great repudiation, the universal bankruptcy of the nations, which will one day happen, although the prophet, in this as in the other case, entertains a firm hope that he will not live to see it himself. From an ethical and a rational point of view, the right of possession rests upon an incomparably better foundation than the right of birth. Nevertheless, the right of possession is allied with the right of birth and has come to be part and parcel of it, so that it would hardly be possible to abolish the right of birth without endangering the right of possession. The reason of this is that most of what a man possesses he inherited, and therefore holds by a kind of right of birth, just as the old nobility bear the names only of their hereditary estates, and by the use of those names do no more than give expression to the fact that they own the estates. Accordingly all owners of property, if instead of envious they were wise, ought also to support the maintenance of the rights of birth. The existence of a nobility has, then, a double advantage. It helps to maintain on the one hand the rights of possession, and on the other the right of birth belonging to the king. For the king is the first nobleman in the country, and, as a general rule, he treats the nobility as his humble relations, and regards them quite otherwise than the commoners, however trusty and well-beloved. It is quite natural, too, that he should have more confidence in those whose ancestors were mostly the first ministers, and always the immediate associates, of his own. A nobleman, therefore, appeals with reason to the name he bears, when on the occurrence of anything to rouse distrust he repeats his assurance of fidelity and service to the king. A man's character, as my readers are aware, assuredly comes to him from his father. It is a narrow-minded and ridiculous thing not to consider whose son a man is. Free will and fatalism. No thoughtful man can have any doubt, after the conclusions reached in my prize essay on moral freedom, that such freedom is to be sought, not anywhere in nature, but outside of it. The only freedom that exists is of a metaphysical character. In the physical world freedom is an impossibility. Accordingly, while our several actions are in no wise free, every man's individual character is to be regarded as a free act. He is such and such a man, because once for all it is his will to be that man. For the will itself, and in itself, and also in so far as it is manifest in an individual, and accordingly constitutes the original and fundamental desires of that individual, is independent of all knowledge, because it is antecedent to such knowledge. All that it from knowledge is the series of motives by which it successively develops its nature and makes itself cognoscible or visible, but the will itself, as something that lies beyond time, and so long as it exists at all, never changes. Therefore every man, being what he is and placed in the circumstances which for the moment obtain, but which on their part also arise by strict necessity, can absolutely never do anything else than just what at that moment he does do. Accordingly, the whole course of a man's life, in all its incidents great and small, is as necessarily predetermined as the course of a clock. The main reason of this is that the kind of metaphysical free act which I have described tends to become a knowing consciousness, a perceptive intuition, which is subject to the forms of space and time. By means of those forms the unity and indivisibility of the act are represented as drawn asunder into a series of states and events, which are subject to the principle of sufficient reason in its four forms, and it is this that is meant by necessity. But the result of it all assumes a moral complexion. It amounts to this, that by what we do we know what we are, and by what we suffer we know what we deserve. Further, it follows from this that a man's individuality does not rest upon the principle of individuation alone, and therefore is not altogether phenomenal in its nature. On the contrary, it has its roots in the thing in itself, in the will which is the essence of each individual. The character of this individual is itself individual. But how deep the of individuality extend is one of the questions which I do not undertake to answer. In this connection it deserves to be mentioned that even Plato, in his own way, represented the individuality of a man as a free act. He represented him as coming into the world with a given tendency, which was the result of the feelings and character already attaching to him in accordance with the doctrine of metempsychosis. The Brahmin philosophers also express the unalterable fixity of innate character in a mystical fashion. They say that Brahma, when a man is produced, engraves his doings and sufferings in written characters on his skull, and that his life must take shape in accordance therewith. The point to the jagged edges in the sutures of the skull bones is evidence of this writing, and the purport of it, they say, depends on his previous life and actions. The same view appears to underlie the Christian, or rather, the Pauline, dogma of predestination. But this truth, which is universally confirmed by experience, is attended with another result. All genuine merit, moral as well as intellectual, is not merely physical or empirical in its origin, but metaphysical, that is to say, it is given a priori and not a posteriori. In other words, it lies innate and is not acquired, and therefore its source is not a mere phenomenon, but the thing in itself. Hence it is that every man achieves only that which is irrevocably established in his nature, or is born with him. Intellectual capacity needs, it is true, to be developed just as many natural products need to be cultivated in order that we may enjoy or use them, but just as in the case of a natural product no cultivation can take the place of original material, neither can it do so in the case of intellect. That is the reason why qualities which are merely acquired, or learned, or enforced, that is, qualities a posteriori, whether moral or intellectual, are not real or genuine, but superficial only, and possessed of no value. This is a conclusion of true metaphysics, and experience teaches the same lesson to all who can look below the surface. Nay, it is proved by the great importance which we all attach to such innate characteristics as physiognomy and external appearance, in the case of a man who is at all distinguished, and that is why we are so curious to see him. Superficial people, to be sure, and, for very good reasons, commonplace people too, will be of the opposite opinion, for if anything fails them they will thus be enabled to console themselves by thinking that it is still to come. The world, then, is not merely a battlefield where victory and defeat receive their due recompense in a future state. No. The world is itself the last judgment on it. Every man carries with him the reward and the disgrace that he deserves, and this is no other than the doctrine of the Brahmins and Buddhists as it is taught in the theory of metempsychosis. The question has been raised, what two men would do, who lived a solitary life in the wilds and met each other for the first time. Hobbes, Pufendorf, and Rousseau have given different answers. Pufendorf believed that they would approach each other as friends, Hobbes, on the contrary, as enemies, Rousseau, that they would pass each other by in silence. All three are both right and wrong. This is just a case in which the incalculable difference that there is in innate moral disposition between one individual and another would make its appearance. The difference is so strong that the question here raised might be regarded as the standard and measure of it. For there are men in whom the sight of another man at once rouses a feeling of enmity, since their inmost nature exclaims at once, "That is not me." There are others in whom the sight awakens immediate sympathy, their inmost nature says, "That is me over again." The two there are countless degrees. That in this most important matter we are so totally different is a great problem, nay, a mystery. In regard to this a priori nature of moral character there is matter for varied reflection in a work by Bastholm, a Danish writer, entitled Historical Contributions to the Knowledge of Man in the Savage State. He is struck by the fact that intellectual culture and moral excellence are shown to be entirely independent of each other, inasmuch as one is often found without the other. The reason of this, as we shall find, is simply that moral excellence in no wise springs from reflection, which is developed by intellectual culture, but from the will itself, the constitution of which is innate and not susceptible in itself of any improvement by means of education. Bastholm represents most nations as very vicious and immoral. And on the other hand he reports that excellent traits of character are found amongst some savage peoples, as, for instance, amongst the Orochezes, the inhabitants of the island Sauveur, the Dumuses, and the Palau Islanders. He thus attempts to solve the problem, how it is that some tribes are so remarkably good, when their neighbors are all bad. It seems to me that the difficulty may be explained as follows. Moral qualities, as we know, are heritable, and an isolated tribe, such as is described, might take its rise in some one family, and ultimately in a single ancestor who happened to be a good man, and then maintain its purity. Is it not the case, for instance, that on many unpleasant occasions, such as repudiation of public debts, filibustering raids and so on, the English have often reminded the North Americans of their descent from English penal colonists? It is a reproach, however, which can apply only to a small part of the population. It is marvelous how every man's individuality, that is to say, the union of a definite character with a definite intellect, accurately determines all his actions and thoughts down to the most unimportant details, as though it were a dye which pervaded them, and how, in consequence, one man's whole course of life, in other words, his inner and outer history, turns out so absolutely different from another's. As a botanist knows a plant in its entirety from a single leaf, as Cuvier from a single bone constructed the whole animal, so an accurate knowledge of a man's whole character may be attained from a single characteristic act, that is to say, he himself may to some extent be constructed from it, even though the act in question is of very trifling consequence. Nay, that is the most perfect test of all, for in a matter of importance people are on their guard, in trifles they follow their natural bent without much reflection. That is why Seneca's remark, that even the smallest things may be taken as evidence of character, is so true, argumentum morum ex minimis quoque licet capere. If a man shows by his absolutely unscrupulous and selfish behavior in small things that a sentiment of justice is foreign to his disposition, he should not be trusted with a penny unless on due security. For who will believe that the man who every day shows that he is unjust in all matters other than those which concern property, and whose boundless selfishness everywhere protrudes through the small affairs of ordinary life which are subject to no scrutiny, like a dirty shirt through the holes of a ragged jacket, who, I ask, will believe that such a man will act honorably in matters of meum and tuum without any other incentive but that of justice? The man who has no conscience in small things will be a scoundrel in big things. If we neglect small traits of character, we have only ourselves to blame if we afterwards learn to our disadvantage what this character is in the great affairs of life. On the same principle, we ought to break with so-called friends even in matters of trifling moment, if they show a character that is malicious or bad or vulgar, so that we may avoid the bad turn which only waits for an opportunity of being done us. The same thing applies to servants. Let it always be our maxim, alone than amongst traitors. Of a truth, the first and foremost step in all knowledge of mankind is the conviction that a man's conduct, taken as a whole, and in all its essential particulars, is not governed by his reason or by any of the resolutions which he may make in virtue of it. No man becomes this or that by wishing to be it, however earnestly. His acts proceed from his innate and unalterable character, and they are more immediately and particularly determined by motives. A man's conduct, therefore, is the necessary product of both character and motive. It may be illustrated by the course of a planet, which is the result of the combined effect of the tangential energy with which it is endowed, and the centripetal energy which operates from the sun. In this simile, the former energy represents character, and the latter the influence of motive. It is almost more than a mere simile. The tangential energy, which properly speaking is the source of the planet's motion, whilst on the other hand the motion is kept in check by gravitation, is, from a metaphysical point of view, the will manifesting itself in that body. To grasp this fact is to see that we really never form anything more than a conjecture of what we shall do under circumstances which are still to happen, although we often take our conjecture for a resolve. When, for instance, in pursuance of a proposal, a man with the greatest sincerity, and even eagerness, accepts an engagement to do this or that on the occurrence of a certain future event, it is by no means certain that he will fulfill the engagement, unless he is so constituted that the promise which he gives, in itself and as such, is always and everywhere a motive sufficient for him, by acting upon him, through considerations of honor, like some external compulsion. But above and beyond this, what he will do on the occurrence of that event may be foretold from true and accurate knowledge of his character and the external circumstances under the influence of which he will fall, and it may with complete certainty be foretold from this alone. Nay, it is a very easy prophecy if he has been already seen in a like position, for he will inevitably do the same thing a second time, provided that on the first occasion he had a true and complete knowledge of the facts of the case. For, as I have often remarked, a final cause does not impel a man by being real, but by being known. Causa finalis non movet secundum suum esse reali, sed secundum esse cognitum. Whatever he failed to recognize or understand the first time could have no influence upon his will, just as an electric current stops when some isolating body hinders the action of the conductor. This unalterable nature of character, and the consequent necessity of our actions, are made very clear to a man who has not, on any given occasion, behaved as he ought to have done, by showing a lack either of resolution or endurance or courage, or some other quality demanded at the moment. Afterwards he recognizes what it is that he ought to have done, and, sincerely repenting of his incorrect behavior, he thinks to himself, if the opportunity were offered to me again, I should act differently. It is offered once more, the same occasion recurs, and to his great astonishment he does precisely the same thing over again. The best examples of the truth in question are in every way furnished by Shakespeare's plays. It is a truth with which he was thoroughly imbued, and his intuitive wisdom expressed it in a concrete shape on every page. I shall here, however, give an instance of it in a case in which he makes it remarkably clear, without exhibiting any design or affectation in the matter, for he was a real artist and never set out from general ideas. His method was obviously to work up to the psychological truth which he grasped directly and intuitively, regardless of the fact that few would notice or understand it, and without the smallest idea that some dull Hallo fellows in Germany would one day proclaim far and wide that he wrote his works to illustrate moral commonplaces. I allude to the character of the Earl of Northumberland, whom we find in 3 plays in succession, although he does not take a leading part in any one of them, nay, he appears only in a few scenes distributed over 15 acts. Consequently, if the reader is not very attentive, a character exhibited at such great intervals, and its moral identity, may easily escape his notice, even though it has by no means escaped the poet's. He makes the Earl appear everywhere with a noble and knightly grace, and talk in language suitable to it, nay, he sometimes puts very beautiful and even elevated passages into his mouth. At the same time he is very far from writing after the manner of Schiller, who was fond of painting the devil black, and whose moral approval or disapproval of the characters which he presented could be heard in their own words. With Shakespeare, and also with Goethe, every character, as long as he is on the stage and speaking, seems to be absolutely in the right, even though it were the devil himself. In this respect let the reader compare Duke Alba as he appears in Goethe with the same character in Schiller. We make the acquaintance of the Earl of Northumberland in the play of Richard XI, where he is the first to hatch a plot against the king in favor of Bolingbroke, afterwards Henry IV, to whom he even offers some personal flattery, Act 11, Sc. 3. In the following act he suffers a reprimand because, in speaking of the king he talks of him as Richard, without more ado, but protests that he did it only for brevity's sake. A little later his insidious words induce the king to surrender. In the following act, when the king renounces the crown, Northumberland treats him with such harshness and contempt that the unlucky monarch is quite broken, and losing all patience once more exclaims to him, "Fiend, thou tormentest me ere I come to hell." At the close, Northumberland announces to the new king that he has sent the heads of the former king's adherents to London. In the following tragedy, Henry IV, he hatches a plot against the new king in just the same way. In the 4th act we see the rebels united, making preparations for the decisive battle on the morrow, and only waiting impatiently for Northumberland and his division. At last there arrives a letter from him, saying that he is ill, and that he cannot entrust his force to any one else, but that nevertheless the others should go forward with courage and make a brave fight. They do so, but, greatly weakened by his absence, they are completely defeated, most of their leaders are captured, and his own son, the valorous Hotspur, falls by the hand of the Prince of Wales. Again, in the following play, the second part of Henry IV, we see him reduced to a state of the fiercest wrath by the death of his son, and maddened by the thirst for revenge. Accordingly he kindles another rebellion, and the heads of it assemble once more. In the 4th act, just as they are about to give battle, and are only waiting for him to join them, there comes a letter saying that he cannot collect a proper force, and will therefore seek safety for the present in Scotland, that, nevertheless, he heartily wishes their heroic undertaking the best success. Thereupon they surrender to the king under a treaty which is not kept, and so perish. So far is character from being the work of reasoned choice and consideration that in any action the intellect has nothing to do but to present motives to the will. Thereafter it looks on as a mere spectator and witness at the course which life takes, in accordance the influence of motive on the given character. All the incidents of life occur, strictly speaking, with the same necessity as the movement of a clock. On this point let me refer to my prize essay on the freedom of the will. I have there explained the true meaning and origin of the persistent illusion that the will is entirely free in every single action, and I have indicated the cause to which it is due. I will only add here the following teleological explanation of this natural illusion. Since every single action of a man's life seems to possess the freedom and originality which in truth only belong to his character as he apprehends it, and the mere apprehension of it by his intellect is what constitutes his career, and since what is original in every single action seems to the empirical consciousness to be always being performed anew, a man thus receives in the course of his career the strongest possible moral lesson. Then, and not before, he becomes thoroughly conscious of all the bad sides of his character. Conscience accompanies every act with the comment, you should act differently, although its true sense is, you could be other than you are. As the result of this immutability of character on the one hand, and, on the other, of the strict necessity which attends all the circumstances in which character is successively placed, every man's course of life is precisely determined from alpha right through to omega. But, nevertheless, one man's course of life comes out immeasurably happier, nobler, and more worthy than another's, whether it be regarded from a or an objective point of view, and unless we are to exclude all ideas of justice, we are led to the doctrine which is well accepted in Brahmanism and Buddhism, that the subjective conditions in which, as well as the objective conditions under which, every man is born, are the moral consequences of a previous existence. Machiavelli, who seems to have taken no interest whatever in philosophical speculations, is drawn by the keen subtlety of his very unique understanding into the following observation, which possesses a really deep meaning. It shows that he had an intuitive knowledge of the entire necessity with which, characters and motives being given, all actions take place. He makes it at the beginning of the prologue to his comedy Cliché. If, he says, the same men were to recur in the world in the way that the same circumstances recur, 100 years would never elapse without our finding ourselves together once more, and doing the same things as we are doing now. Se nel mondo tornasino I medsimi uomini, como tornano I medsimi casi, non passerbano mi sento anni che noi non si trovasimo un'altra volta insieme, a farelli medsime cos che ora. He seems however to have been drawn into the remark by a reminiscence of what Augustine says in his De Civitate Ei, BK 12, ch 13. Again, fate, or the Greek, amar many of the ancients, is nothing but the conscious certainty that all that happens is fast bound by a chain of causes, and therefore takes place with a strict necessity, that the future is already ordained with absolute certainty and can undergo as little alteration as the past. In the fatalistic myths of the ancients all that can be regarded as fabulous is the prediction of the future, that is, if we refuse to consider the possibility of magnetic clairvoyance and second sight. Instead of trying to explain away the fundamental truth of fatalism by superficial twaddle and foolish evasion, a man should attempt to get a clear knowledge and comprehension of it, for it is demonstrably true, and it helps us in a very important way to an understanding of the mysterious riddle of our life. Predestination and fatalism do not differ in the main. They differ only in this, that with predestination the given character and external determination of human action proceed from a rational being, and with fatalism from an irrational one. But in either case the result is the same, that happens which must happen. On the other hand, the conception of moral freedom is inseparable from that of originality. A man may be said, but he cannot be conceived, to be the work of another, and at the same time be free in respect of his desires and acts. He who called him into existence out of nothing in the same process created and determined his nature, in other words, the whole of his qualities. For no one can create without creating a something, that is to say, a being determined throughout and in all its qualities. But all that a man says and does necessarily proceeds from the qualities so determined, for it is only the qualities themselves set in motion. It is only some external impulse that they require to make their appearance. As a man is, so must he act, and praise or blame attaches, not to his separate acts, but to his nature and being. That is the reason why the ism and the moral responsibility of man are incompatible, because responsibility always reverts to the Creator of man, and it is there that it has its center. Vain attempts have been made to make a bridge from one of these incompatibles to the other by means of the conception of moral freedom, but it always breaks down again. Vivihat is free must also be original. If our will is free, our will is also the original element, and conversely. Pre-Kantian dogmatism tried to separate these two predicaments. It was thereby compelled to assume two kinds of freedom, one cosmological, of the first cause, and the other moral and theological, of human will. These are represented in Kant by the third as well as the fourth antinomy of freedom. On the other hand, in my philosophy the plain recognition of the strictly necessary character of all action is in accordance with the doctrine that what manifests itself even in the organic and irrational world is will. If this were not so, the necessity under which irrational obviously act would place their action in conflict with will, if, there were really such a thing as the freedom of individual action, and this were not as strictly necessitated as every other kind of action. But, as I have just shown, it is this same doctrine of the necessary character of all acts of will which makes it needful to regard a man's existence and being as itself the work of his freedom, and consequently of his will. The will, therefore, must be self-existent, it must possess so-called aseity. Under the opposite supposition all responsibility, as I have shown, would be at an end, and the moral like the physical world would be a mere machine, set in motion for the amusement of its manufacturer placed somewhere outside of it. So it is that truths hang together, and mutually advance and complete one another, whereas error gets jostled at every corner. What kind of influence it is that moral instruction may exercise on conduct, and what are the limits of that influence, are questions which I have sufficiently examined in the 20th section of my treatise on the foundation of morality. In all essential particulars an analogous influence is exercised by example, which, however, has a more powerful effect than doctrine, and therefore it deserves a brief analysis. In the main, example works either by restraining a man or by encouraging him. It has the former effect when it determines him to leave undone what he wanted to do. He sees, that other people do not do it, and from this he judges, in general, that it is not expedient, that it may endanger his person, or his property, or his honor. He rests content, and gladly finds himself relieved from examining into the matter for himself. Or he may see that another man, who has not refrained, has incurred evil consequences from doing it. This is example of the deterrent kind. The example which encourages a man works in a twofold manner. It either induces him to do what he would be glad to leave undone, if he were not afraid lest the omission might in some way endanger him, or injure him in others' opinion, or else it encourages him to do what he is glad to do, but has hitherto refrained from doing from fear of danger or shame. This is example of the seductive kind. Finally, example may bring a man to do what he would have otherwise never thought of doing. It is obvious that in this last case example works in the main only on the intellect, its effect on the will is secondary, and if it has any such effect, it is by the interposition of the man's own judgment, or by reliance on the person who presented the example. The whole influence of example in it is very strong, rests on the fact that a man has, as a rule, too little judgment of his own, and often too little knowledge, explore his own way for himself, and that he is glad, therefore, to tread in the footsteps of someone else. Accordingly, the more deficient he is in either of these qualities, the more is he open to the influence of example, and we find, in fact, that most men's guiding star is the example of others, that their whole course of life, in great things and in small, comes in the end to be mere imitation, and that not even in the pettiest matters do they act according to their own judgment. Imitation and custom are the spring of almost all human action. The cause of it is that men fight shy of all and any sort of reflection, and very properly mistrust their own discernment. At the same time this remarkably strong imitative instinct in man is a proof of his kinship with apes. But the kind of effect which example exercises depends upon a man's character, and thus it is that the same example may possibly seduce one man and deter another. An easy opportunity of observing this is afforded in the case of certain social impertinences which come into vogue and gradually spread. The first time that a man notices anything of the kind, he may say to himself, "For shame! How can he do it? How selfish and inconsiderate of him! Really, I shall take care never to do anything like that." But 50 others will think, "Aha! If he does that, I may do it too." As regards morality, example, like doctrine, may, it is true, promote civil or legal amelioration, but not that inward amendment which is, strictly speaking, the only kind of moral amelioration. For example always works as a personal motive alone, and assumes, therefore, that a man is susceptible to this sort of motive. But it is just the predominating sensitiveness of a character to this or that sort of motive that determines whether its morality is true and real, though, of whatever kind it is always innate. In general, it may be said that example operates as a means of promoting the good and the bad qualities of a character, but it does not create them, and so it is that maxim, vel non discitur vil cannot be learned, also holds here. But the innateness of all truly moral qualities, of the good as of the bad, is a doctrine that consorts better with the metempsychosis of the Brahmins and Buddhists, according to which a man's and bad deeds follow him from one existence to another like his shadow, than with Judaism. For Judaism requires a man to come into the world as a moral blank, so that, in virtue of an inconceivable free will, directed to objects which are neither to be sought nor avoided liberum arbitrium indifferentia, and consequently as the result of reasoned consideration, he may choose whether he is to be an angel, devil, or anything else that may lie between the two. Though I am well aware what the Jewish scheme is, I pay no attention to it, for my standard is truth. I am no professor of philosophy, and therefore I do not find my vocation in establishing the fundamental ideas of Judaism at any cost, even though they forever bar the way to all and every kind of philosophical knowledge. Liberum arbitrium indifferentia under the name of moral freedom is a charming doll for professors of philosophy to dandle, and we must leave it to those intelligent, honorable, and upright gentlemen. Character. Men who aspire to a happy, a brilliant, and a long life, instead of to a virtuous one, are like foolish actors who want to be always having the great parts, the parts that are marked by splendor and triumph. They fail to see that the important thing is not what or how much, but how they act. Since a man does not alter, and his moral character remains absolutely the same all through his life, since he must play out the part which he has received, without the least deviation from the character, since neither experience, nor philosophy, nor religion can effect any improvement in him, the question arises, vivat is the meaning of life at all? To what purpose is it played, this farce in which everything that is essential is irrevocably fixed and determined? It is played that a man may come to understand himself, that he may see what it is that he seeks and has sought to be, what he wants, and what, therefore, he is. This is a knowledge which must be imparted to him from without. Life is to man, in other words, to will, what chemical reagents are to the body. It is only by life that a man reveals what he is, and it is only in so far as he reveals himself that he exists at all. Life is the manifestation of character, of the something that we understand by that word, and it is not in life, but outside of it, and outside time, that character undergoes alteration, as a result of the self-knowledge which life gives. Life is only the mirror into which a man gazes, not in order that he may get a reflection of himself, but that he may come to understand himself by that reflection, that he may see what it is that the mirror shows. Life is the proof sheet, in which the compositor's errors are brought to light. How they become visible, and whether the type is large or small, are matters of no consequence. Neither in the externals of life nor in the course of history is there any signific, for as it is all one whether an error occurs in the large type or in the small, so it is all one, as regards the essence of the matter, whether an evil disposition is mirrored as a conqueror of the world or a common swindler or ill-natured egoist. In one case he is seen of all men, in the other, perhaps only of himself, but that he should see himself is what signifies. Therefore, if egoism has a firm hold of a man and masters him, whether it be in the form of joy, or triumph, or lust, or hope, or frantic grief, or annoyance, or anger, or fear, or suspicion, or passion of any kind, he is in the devil's clutches, and how he got into them does not matter. Vnvhat is needful is that he should make haste to get out of them, and here, again, it does not matter how. I have described character as theoretically an act of will lying beyond time, of which life in time, or character in action, is the development. For matters of practical life we all possess the one as well as the other, for we are constituted of them both. Character modifies our life more than we think, and it is to a certain extent true that every man is the architect of his own fortune. No doubt it seems as if our lot were assigned to us almost entirely from without, and imparted to us in something of the same way in which a melody outside us reaches the ear. But on looking back over our past, we see at once that our life consists of mere variations on one and the same theme, namely, our character, and that the same fundamental bass sounds through it all. This is an experience which a man can and must make, and by himself not only a man's life, but his intellect too, may be possessed of a clear and definite character, so far as his intellect is applied to matters of theory. It is not every man, however, who has an intellect of this kind, for any such definite individuality as I mean is genius, an original view of the world, which presupposes an absolutely exceptional individuality, which is the essence of genius. A man's intellectual character is the theme on which all his works are variations. In an essay which I wrote in Weimar I called it the knack by which every genius produces his works, however various. This intellectual character determines the physiognomy of men of genius, what I might call the theoretical physiognomy, and gives it that distinguished expression which is chiefly seen in the eyes and the forehead. In the case of ordinary men the physiognomy presents no more than a weak analogy with the physiognomy of genius. On the other hand, all men possess the practical physiognomy, the stamp of will, of practical character, of moral disposition, and it shows itself chiefly in the mouth. Since character, so far as we understand its nature, is above and time, it cannot undergo any change under the influence of life. But although it must necessarily remain the same always, it requires time to unfold itself and show the very diverse aspects which it may possess. For character consists of two factors: 1. The will to live itself, blind impulse, so-called impetuosity; the other, the restraint which the will acquires when it comes to understand the world, and the world, again, is itself will. A man may begin by following the craving of desire, until he comes to see how hollow and unreal a thing is life, how deceitful are its pleasures, what horrible aspects it possesses, and this it is that makes people hermits, penitents, Magdalenes. Nevertheless, it is to be observed that no such change from a life of great indulgence in pleasure to one of resignation is possible, except to the man who of his own accord renounces pleasure. A really bad life cannot be changed into a virtuous one. The most beautiful soul, before it comes to know life from its horrible side, may eagerly drink the sweets of life and remain innocent. But it cannot commit a bad action, it cannot cause others suffering to do a pleasure to itself, for in that case it would see clearly what it would be doing, and whatever be its youth and inexperience it perceives the sufferings of others as clearly as its own pleasures. That is why one bad action is a guarantee that numberless others will be committed as soon as circumstances give occasion for them. Somebody once remarked to me, with entire justice, that every man had something very inhumane in his disposition, and also something very bad and malignant, and that according as he was moved one or the other of them made its appearance. The sight of others suffering arouses, not only in different men, but in one and the same man, at one moment an inexhaustible sympathy, at another a certain satisfaction, and this satisfaction may increase until it becomes the cruelest delight in pain. I observe in myself that at one moment I regard all mankind with heartfelt pity, at another with the greatest indifference, on occasion with hatred, nay, with a positive enjoyment of their pain. All this shows very clearly that we are possessed of two different, nay, absolutely contradictory, ways of regarding the world, one according to the principle of individuation, which exhibits all creatures as entire strangers to us, as definitely not ourselves. We can have no feelings for them but those of indifference, envy, hatred, and delight that they suffer. The other way of regarding the world is in accordance with what I may call the tat toi me ci, this is thyself principle. All creatures are exhibited as identical with ourselves, and so it is pity and love which the sight of them arouses. The one method separates individuals by impassable barriers, the other removes the barrier and brings the individuals together. The one makes us feel, in regard to every man, that is what I am; the other, that is not what I am. But it is remarkable that while the sight of another's suffering makes us feel our identity with him, and arouses our pity, this is not so with the sight of another's happiness. Then we almost always feel some envy, and even though we may have no such feeling in certain cases, as, for instance, when our friends are happy, yet the interest which we take in their happiness is of a weak description, and cannot compare with the sympathy which we feel with their suffering. Is this because we recognize all happiness to be a delusion, or an impediment to true welfare? No. I am inclined to think that it is because the sight of the pleasure, or the possessions, which are denied to us, arouses envy, that is to say, the wish that we, and not the other, had that pleasure or those possessions. It is only the first way of looking at the world which is founded on any demonstrable reason. The other is, as it were, the gate out of this world. It has no attestation beyond itself, unless it be the very abstract and difficult proof which my doctrine supplies. 6. The first way predominates in one man, and the second in another, though perhaps it does not exclusively predominate in any man. Why the one or the other emerges according as the will is moved, these are deep problems. The paths of night and day are close together. Greek, Ingiskar nutos dekai ematos izekilithoi. It is a fact that there is a great and original difference between one empirical character and another, and it is a difference which, at bottom, rests upon the relation of the individual's will to his intellectual faculty. This relation is finally determined by the degree of will in his father and of intellect in his mother, and the union of father and mother is for the most part an affair of chance. This would all mean a revolting injustice in the nature of the world, if it were not that the difference between parents and son is phenomenal only in all chances, at bottom, necessity. As regards the freedom of the will, if it were the case that the will manifested itself in a single act alone, it would be a free act. But the will manifests itself in a course of life, that is to say, in a series of acts. Every one of these acts, therefore, is determined as a part of a complete whole, and cannot happen otherwise than it does happen. On the other hand, the whole series is free, it is simply the manifestation of an individualist will. If a man feels inclined to commit a bad action and refrains, he is kept back either, 1. By fear of punishment or vengeance, or, 2. By superstition, in other words, fear of punishment in a future life, or, 3. By the feeling of sympathy, including general charity, or, 4. By the feeling of honor, in other words, the fear of shame, or, 5. By the feeling of justice, that is, an attachment to fidelity and good faith, coupled with a resolve to hold them sacred, because they are the foundation of all free intercourse between man and man, and therefore often of advantage to himself as well. This last thought, not indeed as a thought, but as a mere feeling, influences people very frequently. It is this that often compels a man of honor, when some great but unjust advantage is offered him, to reject it with contempt and proudly exclaim, "I am an honorable man." For otherwise how should a poor man, confronted with the property which chance or even some worse agency has bestowed on the rich, whose very existence it is that makes him poor, feel so much sincere respect for this property, that he refuses to touch it even in his need, and although he has a prospect of escaping punishment, what other thought is it that can be at the bottom of such a man's honesty? He is resolved not to separate himself from the great community of honorable people who have the earth in possession, and whose laws are recognized everywhere. He knows that a single dishonest act will ostracize and proscribe him from that society forever. No. A man will spend money on any soil that yields him good fruit, and he will make sacrifices for it. With a good action, that, every action in which a man's own advantage is ostensibly subordinated to another's, the motive is either, 1. Self-interest, kept in the background, or, 2. Superstition, in other words, self-interest in the form of reward in another life, or, 3. Sympathy, or, 4. The desire to lend a helping hand, in other words, attachment to the maxim that we should assist one another in need, and the wish to maintain this maxim, in view of the presumption that some day we ourselves may find it serve our tum. For what Kant calls a action done from motives of duty and for the sake of duty, there is, as will be seen, no room at all. Kant himself declares it to be doubtful whether an action was ever determined by pure motives of duty alone. I affirm most certainly that no action was ever so done. It is mere babble, there is nothing in it that could really act as a motive to any man. Vyman he shelters himself behind verbiage of that sort, he is always actuated by one of the four motives which I have described. Among these it is obviously sympathy alone which is quite genuine and sincere. Good and bad apply to character only a posteriori, that is to say, we prefer the good to the bad, but, absolutely, there is no such distinction. The difference arises at the point which lies between subordinating one's own advantage to that of another, and not subordinating it. If a man keeps to the exact middle, he is just. But most men go an inch in their regard for others' welfare to 50 yards in regard for their own. The source of good and of bad character, so far as we have any real knowledge of it, lies in this, that with the bad character the thought of the external world, and especially of the living creatures in it, is accompanied all the more, the greater the resemblance between them and the individual self by a constant feeling of not I, not I, not I. Contrarily, with the good character, both being assumed to exist in a high degree, the same thought has for its accompaniment, like a fundamental base, a constant feeling of I. From this spring benevolence and a disposition to help all men, and at the same time a cheerful, confident, and tranquil frame of mind, the opposite of that which accompanies the bad character. The difference, however, is only phenomenal, although it is a difference which is radical. But now we come to the hardest of all problems. How is it that, while the will, as the thing in itself, is identical, and from a metaphysical point of view one and the same in all its manifestations, there is nevertheless such an enormous difference between one character and another? The malicious, diabolical wickedness of the one, and set off against it, the goodness of the other, showing all the more conspicuously. How is it that we get a Tiberius, a Caligula, a Caracalla, a Domitian, a Nero, and on the other hand, the Antonines, Titus, Hadrian, Nerva? How is it that among the animals, nay, in a higher species, in individual animals, there is a like difference? The malignity of the cat most strongly developed in the tiger, the spite of the monkey, on the other hand, goodness, fidelity, and love in the dog and the elephant. It is obvious that the principle of wickedness in the brute is the same as in man. We may to some extent modify the difficulty of the problem by observing that the whole difference is in the end only one of degree. In every living creature, the fundamental propensities and instincts all exist, but they exist in very different degrees and proportions. This, however, is not enough to explain the facts. We must fall back upon the intellect and its relation to the will. It is the only explanation that remains. A man's intellect, however, by no means stands in any direct and obvious relation with the goodness of his character. We may, it is true, discriminate between two kinds of intellect, between understanding, as the apprehension of relation in accordance with the principle of sufficient reason, and cognition, a faculty akin to genius, which acts more directly, is independent of this law, and passes beyond the principle of individuation. The latter is the faculty which apprehends ideas, and it is the faculty which has to do with morality. But even this explanation leaves much to be desired. Fine minds are seldom fine souls was the correct observation of Jean Paul, although they are never the contrary. Lord Bacon, who, to be sure, was less a fine soul than a fine mind, was a scoundrel. I have declared space and time to be part of the principle of individuation, as it is only space and time that make the multiplicity of similar objects a possibility. But multiplicity itself also admits of variety. Multiplicity and diversity are not only quantitative, but also qualitative. How is it that there is such a thing as qualitative diversity, especially in ethical matters? Or have I fallen into an error the opposite of that in which Leibniz fell with his identitas indiscernibilium? The chief cause of intellectual diversity is to be found in the brain and nervous system. This is a fact which somewhat lessens the obscurity of the with the brutes. The intellect and the brain are strictly adapted to their aims and needs. With man alone there is now and then, by way of exception, a superfluity, which, if it is abundant, may yield genius. But ethical diversity, it seems, proceeds immediately from the will. Otherwise ethical character would not be above and beyond time, as it is only in the individual that intellect and will are united. The will is above and beyond time, and eternal, and character is innate, that is to say, it is sprung from the same eternity, and therefore it does not admit of any but a transcendental explanation. Perhaps someone will come after me who will throw light into this dark abyss. Moral instinct. An act done by instinct differs from every other kind of act in that an understanding of its object does not it but follows upon it. Instinct is therefore a rule of action given priori. We may be unaware of the object to which it is directed, as no understanding of it is necessary to its attainment. On the other hand, if an act is done by an exercise of reason or intelligence, it proceeds according to a rule which the understanding has itself devised for the purpose of carrying out a preconceived aim. Hence it is that action according to rule may miss its aim, while instinct is infallible. On the priori character of instinct we may compare what Plato says in the Philebus. With Plato, instinct is a reminiscence of something which a man has never actually experienced in his lifetime, in the same way as, in the Phaedo and elsewhere, everything that a man learns is regarded as a reminiscence. He has no other word to express the a priori element in all experience. There are, then, three things that are a priori. 1. Theoretical reason, in other words, the conditions which make all experience possible. 2. Instinct, or the rule by which an object promoting the life of the senses may, though unknown, be attained. 3. The moral law, or the rule by which an action takes place without any accordingly rational or intelligent action proceeds by a rule laid down in accordance with the as it is understood. Instinctive action proceeds by a rule without an understanding of the object of it. Moral action proceeds by a rule without any object at all. Theoretical reason is the aggregate of rules in accordance with which all my knowledge, that is to say, the whole world of experience, necessarily proceeds. In the same manner instinct is the aggregate of rules in accordance with which all my action necessarily proceeds if it meets with no obstruction. Hence it seems to me that instinct may most appropriately be called practical reason, for like theoretical reason it determines the must of all experience. The so-called moral law, on the other hand, is only one aspect of the better consciousness, the aspect which it presents from the point of view of instinct. This better consciousness is something lying beyond all experience, that is, beyond all reason, whether of the theoretical or the practical kind, and has nothing to do with it, whilst it is in virtue of the mysterious union of it and reason in the same individual that the better consciousness comes into conflict with reason, leaving the individual to choose between the two. In any conflict between the better consciousness and reason, if the individual decides for reason, should it be theoretical reason, he becomes a narrow, pedantic Philistine; should it be practical, a rascal. If he decides for the better consciousness, we can make no further positive affirmation about him, for if we were to do so, we should find ourselves in the realm of reason, and as it is only what takes place within this realm that we can speak of at all, it follows that we cannot speak of the better consciousness except in negative terms. This shows us how it is that reason is hindered and obstructed, that theoretical reason is suppressed in favor of genius, and practical reason in favor of virtue. Now the better consciousness is neither theoretical nor practical, for these are distinctions that only apply to reason. But if the individual is in the act of choosing, the better consciousness appears to him in the aspect which it assumes in vanquishing and overcoming the practical reason, or instinct, to use the common word. It appears to him as an imperative command, an ought. It so appears to him, I say, in other words, that is the shape which it takes for the theoretical reason which renders all things into objects and ideas. But in so far as the better consciousness desires to vanquish and overcome the theoretical reason, it takes no shape at all, on the simple ground that, as it comes into play, the theoretical reason is suppressed and becomes the mere servant of the better consciousness. That is why genius can never give any account of its own works. In the morality of action, the legal principle that both sides are to be heard must not be allowed to apply. In other words, the claims of self and the senses must not be urged. Nay, on the contrary, as soon as the pure will has found expression, the case is closed, nec audienda altera pars. The lower animals are not endowed with moral freedom. Probably this is not because they show no trace of the better consciousness which in us is manifested as morality, or nothing analogous to it, for, if that were so, the lower animals, which are in so many respects like ourselves in outward appearance that we regard man as a species of animal, would possess some raison d'être entirely different from our own, and actually be, in their essential and inmost nature, something quite other than ourselves. This is a contention which is obviously refuted by the thoroughly malignant and inherently vicious character of certain animals, such as the crocodile, the hyena, the scorpion, the snake, and the gentle, affectionate and contented character of others, such as the dog. Here, as in the case of men, the character, as it is manifested, must rest upon something that is above and beyond time. For, as Jacob Boehme says, there is a power in every animal which is indestructible, and the spirit of the world draws it into itself, against the final separation at the last judgment. Therefore we cannot call the lower animals free, and the reason why we cannot do so is that they are wanting in a faculty which is profoundly subordinate to the better consciousness in its highest phase, I mean reason. Reason is the faculty of supreme comprehension, the idea of totality. How reason manifests itself in the theoretical sphere Kant has shown, and it does the same in the practical. It makes us capable of observing and surveying the whole of our life, thought, and action, in continual connection, and therefore of acting according to general maxims, whether those maxims originate in the understanding as prudential rules, or in the better consciousness as moral laws. If any desire or passion is aroused in us, we, and in the same way the lower animals, are for the moment filled this desire, we are all anger, all lust, all fear, and in such moments neither the better consciousness can speak, nor the understanding consider the consequences. But in our case reason allows us even at that moment to see our actions in our life as an unbroken chain, a chain which connects our earlier resolutions, or, it may be, the future consequences of our action, with the moment of passion which now fills our whole consciousness. It shows us the identity of our person, even when that person is exposed to influences of the most varied kind, and thereby we are enabled to act according to maxims. The lower animal is wanting in this faculty. The passion which seizes it completely dominates it, and can be checked only by another passion, anger, for instance, or lust, by fear, even though the vision that terrifies does not appeal to the senses, but is present in the animal only as a dim memory and imagination. Men, therefore, may be called irrational, if, like the lower animals, they allow themselves to be determined by the moment. So far, however, is reason from being the source of morality that it is reason alone which makes us capable of rascals, which the lower animals cannot be. It is reason which enables us to form an evil resolution and to keep it when the provocation to evil is removed. It enables us, for example, to nurse vengeance. Although at the moment that we have an opportunity of fulfilling our resolution the better consciousness may manifest itself as love or charity, it is by force of reason, in pursuance of some evil maxim, that we act against it. Thus Goethe says that a man may use his reason only for the purpose of being more bestial than any beast, hat vernunfit, doch braucht sie alienum therischer als jeds their for not only do we, like the beasts, satisfy the desires of the moment, but we refine upon them and stimulate them in order to prepare the desire for the satisfaction. Whenever we think that we perceive a trace of reason in the lower animals, it fills us with surprise. Now our surprise is not excited by the good and affectionate disposition which some of them exhibit. We recognize that as something other than reason, but by some action in them which seems to be determined not by the impression of the moment, but by a resolution previously made and kept. Elephants, for instance, are reported to have taken premeditated revenge for insults long after they were suffered, lions to have requited benefits on an opportunity tardily offered. The truth of such stories has, however, no bearing at all on the question, what do we mean by reason? But they enable us to decide whether in the lower animals there is any trace of anything that we can call reason. Kant not only declares that all our moral sentiments originate in reason, but he lays down that reason, in my sense of the word, is a condition of moral action, as he holds that for an action to be virtuous and meritorious it must be done in accordance with maxims, and not spring from a resolve taken under some momentary impression. But in both contentions he is wrong. If I resolve to take vengeance on someone, and when an opportunity offers, the better consciousness in the form of love and humanity speaks its word, and I am influenced by it rather than by my evil resolution, this is a virtuous act, for it is a manifestation of the better consciousness. It is possible to conceive of a very virtuous man in whom the better consciousness is so continuously active that it is never silent, and never allows his passions to get a complete hold of him. By such consciousness he is subject to a direct control, instead of being guided indirectly, through the medium of reason, by means of maxims and moral principles. That is why a man may have weak reasoning powers and a weak understanding and yet have a high sense of morality and be eminently good, for the most important element in a man depends as little on intellectual as it does on physical strength. Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." And Jacob Boehme has the excellent and noble observation, Viejoso lies quietly in his own will, like a child in the womb, and lets himself be led and guided by that inner principle from which he is sprung, is the noblest and richest on earth. Ethical Reflections. The philosophers of the ancient world united in a single conception a great many things that had no connection with one another. Of this every dialogue of Plato's furnishes abundant examples. The greatest and worst confusion of this kind is that between ethics and politics. The state and the kingdom of God, or the moral law, are so entirely different in their character that the former is a parody of the latter, a bitter mockery at the absence of it. Compared with the moral law, the state is a crutch instead of a limb, an automaton instead of a man. The principle of honor stands in close connection with human freedom. It is, as it were, an abuse of that freedom. Instead of using his freedom to fulfill the moral law, a man employs his power of voluntarily undergoing any feeling of pain, of overcoming any momentary impression, in order that he may assert his self-will, whatever be the object to which he directs it. As he thereby shows that, unlike the lower animals, he has thoughts which go the welfare of his body and whatever makes for that welfare, it has come about that the principle of honor is often confused with virtue. They are regarded as if they were twins. But wrongly, for although the principle of honor is something which distinguishes from the lower animals, it is not, in itself, anything that raises him above them. Taken as an end and aim, it is as dark a delusion as any other aim that springs from self. Used as a means, or casually, it may be productive of good, but even that is good which is vain and frivolous. It is the misuse of freedom, the employment of it as a weapon for overcoming the world of feeling, that makes man so infinitely more terrible than the lower animals, for they do only what momentary instinct bids them, while man acts by ideas, and his ideas may entail universal ruin before they are satisfied. There is another circumstance which helps to promote the notion that honor and virtue are connected. A man who can do what he wants to do shows that he can also do it if what he wants to do is a virtuous act. But that those of our actions which we are ourselves obliged to regard with contempt are also regarded contempt by other people serves more than anything that I have here mentioned to establish the connection. Thus it often happens that a man who is not afraid of the one kind of contempt is unwilling to undergo the other. But when we are called upon to choose between our own approval and the world's censure, as may occur in complicated and mistaken circumstances, what becomes of the principle of honor then? Two characteristic examples of the principle of honor are to be found in Shakespeare's Henry VI. Part 11. Act 4, Sc. 1. A pirate is anxious to murder his captive instead of accepting, like others, a ransom for him, because in taking his captive he lost an eye, and his own honor and that of his forefathers would in his opinion be stained, if he were to allow his revenge to be bought off as though he were a mere traitor. The prisoner, on the other hand, who is the Duke of Suffolk, prefers to have his head grace a pole than to uncover it to such a low fellow as a pirate, by approaching him to ask for mercy. Just as civic honor, in other words, the opinion that we deserve to be trusted, is the palladium of those whose endeavor it is to make their way in the world on the path of honorable business, so knightly honor, in other words, the opinion that we are men to be feared, is the palladium of those who aim at going through life on the path of violence, and so it was that knightly honor arose among the robber knights and other knights of the Middle Ages. A theoretical philosopher is one who can supply in the shape of ideas for the reason, a copy of the presentations of experience, just as what the painter sees he can reproduce on canvas, the sculptor, in marble, the poet, in pictures for the imagination, though they are pictures which he supplies only in sowing the ideas from which they sprang. A so-called practical philosopher, on the other hand, is one who, contrarily deduces his action from ideas. The theoretical philosopher transforms life into ideas. The practical philosopher transforms ideas into life. He acts, therefore, in a thoroughly reasonable manner. He is consistent, regular, deliberate. He is never hasty or passionate. He never allows himself to be influenced by the impression of the moment. And indeed, when we find ourselves among those full presentations of experience, or real objects, to which the body belongs, since the body is only an objectified will, the shape which the will assumes in the material world, it is difficult to let our bodies be guided, not by those presentations, but by a mere image of them, by cold, colorless ideas, which are related to experience as the shadow of Arcus to life, and yet this is the only way in which we can avoid doing things of which we may have to repent. The theoretical philosopher enriches the domain of reason by adding to it, the practical philosopher draws upon it, and makes it serve him. According to Kant, the truth of experience is only a hypothetical truth. If the suppositions which underlie all the intimations of experience, subject, time, space and causality, were removed, none of those intimations would contain a word of truth. In other words, experience is only a phenomenon, it is not knowledge of the thing in itself. If we find something in our own conduct at which we are secretly pleased, although we cannot reconcile it with experience, seeing that if we were to follow the guidance of experience we should have to do precisely the opposite, we must not allow this to put us out, otherwise we should be ascribing an authority to experience which it does not deserve, for all that it teaches rests upon a mere supposition. This is the general tendency of the Kantian ethics. Innocence is in its very nature stupid. It is stupid because the aim of life, I use the expression only figuratively, and I could just as well speak of the essence of life, or of the world, is to gain a knowledge of our own bad will, so that our will may become an object for us, and that we may undergo an inward conversion. Our body is itself our will, it is one of the first and foremost of objects, and the deeds that we accomplish for the sake of the body show us the evil inherent in our will. In the state of innocence, where there is no evil because there is no experience, man is, as it were, only an apparatus for living, and the object for which the apparatus exists is not yet disclosed. An empty form of life like this, a stage untenanted, is in itself, like the so-called real world, null and void, and as it can attain a meaning only by action, by error, by knowledge, by the convulsions of the will, it wears a character of insipid stupidity. A golden age of innocence, a fool's paradise, is a notion that is stupid and unmeaning, and for that very reason in no way worthy of any respect. The first criminal and murderer, Cain, who acquired a knowledge of guilt, and through guilt acquired a knowledge of virtue by repentance, and so came to understand the meaning of life, is a tragical figure more significant, and almost more respectable, than all the innocent fools in the world put together. If I had to write about modesty I should say, I know the esteemed public for which I have the honor to write far too well to dare to give utterance to my opinion about this virtue. Personally I am quite content to be modest and to apply myself to this virtue the utmost possible circumspection. But one thing I shall never admit, that I have ever required modesty of any man, and any statement to that effect I repel as a slander. The paltry character of most men compels the few who have any merit or genius to behave as though they did not know their own value, and consequently did not know other people's want of value, for it is only on this condition that the mob acquiesces in tolerating merit. A virtue has been made out of this necessity, and it is called modesty. It is a piece of hypocrisy, to be excused only because other people are so paltry that they must be treated indulgence. Human misery may affect us in two ways, and we may be in one of two opposite moods in regard to it. In one of them, this misery is immediately present to us. We feel it in our own person, in our own will which, imbued with violent desires, is everywhere broken, and this is the process which constitutes suffering. The result is that the will increases in violence, as is shown in all cases of passion and emotion, and this increasing violence comes to a stop only when the will turns and gives way to complete resignation, in other words, is redeemed. The man who is entirely dominated by this mood will regard any prosperity which he may see in others with envy, and any suffering with no sympathy. In the opposite mood, human misery is present to us only as a fact of knowledge, that is to say, indirectly. We are mainly engaged in the sufferings of others, and our attention is withdrawn from our own. It is in their person that we become aware of human misery, we are filled with sympathy, and the result of this mood is general benevolence, philanthropy. All envy vanishes, and instead of feeling it, we are rejoiced when we see one of our tormented fellow creatures experience any pleasure or relief. After the same fashion we may be in one of two opposite moods in regard to human baseness and depravity. In the one we perceive this baseness indirectly, in others. Out of this mood arise indignation, hatred, and contempt of mankind. In the other we perceive it directly, in ourselves. Out of it there arises humiliation, nay, contrition. In order to judge the moral value of a man, it is very important to observe which of these four moods predominate in him. They go in pairs, one out of each division. In very excellent characters the second mood of each division will predominate. The categorical imperative, or absolute command, is a contradiction. Every command is conditional. 6 is unconditional and necessary is a must, such as is presented by the laws of nature. It is quite true that the moral law is entirely conditional. There is a world and a view of life in which it has neither validity nor significance. That world is, properly speaking, the real world in which, as individuals, we live, for every regard paid to morality is a denial of that world and of our individual life in it. It is a view of the world, however, which does not go beyond the principle of sufficient reason, and the opposite view proceeds by the intuition of ideas. If a man is under the influence of two opposite but very strong motives, A and B, and I am greatly concerned that he should choose A, but still more that he should never be untrue to his choice, and by changing his mind betray me, or the like, it will not do for me to say anything that might hinder the motive B from having its full effect upon him, and only emphasize A, for then I should never be able to reckon on his decision. I have to do is, rather, to put both motives before him at the same time, in as vivid and clear a way as possible, so that they may work upon him with their whole force. The choice that he then makes is the decision of his inmost nature, and stands firm to all eternity. In saying I will do this, he has said I must do this. I have got at his will, and I can rely upon its working as steadily as one of the forces of nature. It is as certain as fire kindles and water wets that he will act according to the motive which has proved to be stronger for him. Insight and knowledge may be attained and lost again, they may be changed, or improved, or destroyed, but will cannot be changed. That is why I apprehend, I perceive, I see, is subject to alteration and uncertainty. I will, pronounced on a right apprehension of motive, is as firm as nature itself. The difficulty, however, lies in getting at a right apprehension. A man's apprehension of motive may change, or be corrected or perverted, and on the other hand, his circumstances may undergo an alteration. A man should exercise an almost boundless toleration and placability, because if he is capricious enough to refuse to forgive a single individual for the meanness or evil that lies at his door, it is doing the rest of the world a quite unmerited honor. But at the same time the man who is everyone's friend is no one's friend. It is quite obvious what sort of friendship it is which we hold out to the human race, and to which it is open to almost every man to return, no matter what he may have done. With the ancients friendship was one of the chief elements in morality. But friendship is only limitation and partiality, it is the restriction to one individual of what is the due of all mankind, namely, the recognition that a man's own nature and that of mankind are identical. At most it is a compromise between this recognition and selfishness. A lie always has its origin in the desire to extend the dominion of one's own will over other individuals, and to deny their will in order the better to affirm one's own. Consequently a lie is in its very nature the product of injustice, malevolence and villainy. That is why truth, sincerity, candor and rectitude are at once recognized and valued as praiseworthy and noble qualities, because we presume that the man who exhibits them entertains no sentiments of injustice or malice, and therefore stands in no need of concealing such sentiments. He who is open cherishes nothing that is bad. There is a certain kind of courage which springs from the same source as good nature. What I mean is that the good-natured man is almost as clearly conscious that he exists in other individuals as in himself. I have often shown how this feeling gives rise to good nature. It also gives rise to courage, for the simple reason that the man who possesses this feeling cares less for his own individual existence, as he lives almost as much in the general existence of all creatures. Accordingly, he is little concerned for his own life and its belongings. This is by no means the sole source of courage, for it is a phenomenon due to various causes. But it is the noblest kind of courage, as is shown by the fact that in its origin it is associated with great gentleness and patience. Men of this kind are usually irresistible to women. All general rules and precepts fail, because they proceed from the false assumption that men are constituted wholly, or almost wholly, alike, an assumption which the philosophy of Helvetius expressly makes. Nereus, the truth is that the original difference between individuals in intellect and morality is immeasurable. The question as to whether morality is something real is the question whether a well-grounded counter-principle to egoism actually exists. As egoism restricts concern for welfare to a single individual, viz. the man's own self, the counter-principle would have to extend it to all other individuals. It is only because the will is above and beyond time that the stings of conscience are ineradicable, and do not, like other pains, gradually wear away. No. An evil deed weighs on the conscience years afterwards as heavily as if it had been freshly committed. Character is innate, and conduct is merely its manifestation. The occasion for great misdeeds comes seldom, strong counter-motives keep us back. Our disposition is revealed to ourselves by our desires, thoughts, emotions, when it remains unknown to others. Reflecting on all this, we might suppose it possible for a man to possess, in some sort, an innate evil conscience, without ever having done anything very bad. Don't do to others what you wouldn't like done to yourself. This is, perhaps, one of those arguments that prove, or rather ask, too much. For a prisoner might address it to a judge. Stupid people are generally malicious, for the very same reason as the ugly and the deformed. Similarly, genius and sanctity are akin. However simple-minded a saint may, he will nevertheless have a dash of genius in him, and however many errors of temperament, or of actual character, a genius may possess, he will still exhibit a certain nobility of disposition by which he shows his kinship with the saint. The great difference between law without and law within, between the state and the kingdom of God, is very clear. It is the state's business to see that everyone should have justice done to him. It regards men as passive beings, and therefore takes no account of anything but their actions. The moral law, on the other hand, is concerned that everyone should do justice. It regards men as active, and looks to the will rather than the deed. To prove that this is the true distinction, let the reader consider what would happen if he were to say, conversely, that it is the state's business that everyone should do justice, and the business of the moral law that everyone should have justice done to him. The absurdity is obvious. As an example of the distinction, let me take the case of a debtor and a creditor disputing about a debt which the former denies. A lawyer and a moralist are present, and show a lively interest in the matter. Both desire that the dispute should end in the same way, although what they want is by no means the same. The lawyer says, "I want this man to get back what belongs to him," and the moralist, "I want that man to do his duty." It is with the will alone that morality is concerned. Whether external force hinders or fails to hinder the will from working does not in the least matter. For morality, the external world is real only in so far as it is able or unable to lead and influence the will. As soon as the will is determined, that is, as soon as a resolve is taken, the external world and its events are of no further moment and practical do not exist. For if the events of the world had any such reality, that is to say, if they possessed a significance themselves, or any other than that derived from the will which is affected by them, what a grievance it would be that all these events lie in the realm of chance and error. It is, however, just this which proves that the important thing is not what happens, but what is willed. Accordingly, let the incidents of life be left to the play of chance and error, to demonstrate to man that he is as chaff before the wind. The state concerns itself only with the incidents, with what happens, nothing else has any reality for it. I may dwell upon thoughts of murder and poison as much as I please, the state does not forbid me, so long as the axe and rope control my will, and prevent it from becoming action. Ethics asks, what are the duties towards others which justice imposes upon us? In other words, what must I render? The law of nature asks, what need I not submit to from others? That is, what must I suffer? The question is put, not that I may do no injustice, but that I may not do more than every man must do if he is to safeguard his existence, and than every man will approve being done, in order that he may be treated in the same way himself, and, further, that I may not do more than society will permit me to do. The same answer will serve for both questions, just as the same straight line can be drawn from either of two opposite directions, namely, by opposing forces, or, again, as the angle can give the sine, or the sine the angle. It has been said that the historian is an inverted prophet. In the same way it may be said that a teacher of law is an inverted moralist, viz., a teacher of the duties of justice, or that politics are inverted ethics, if we exclude the thought that ethics also teaches the duty of benevolence, magnanimity, love, and so on. The state is the Gordian knot that is cut instead of being untied, it is Columbus' egg which is made to stand by being broken instead of balanced, as though the business in question were to make it stand rather than to balance it. In this respect the state is like the man who thinks that he can produce fine weather by making the barometer go up. The pseudo-philosophers of our age tell us that it is the object of the state to promote the moral aims of mankind. This is not true, it is rather the contrary which is true. The aim for which mankind exists, the expression is parabolic, is not that a man should act in such and such a manner, for all operata, things that have actually been done, are in themselves matters of indifference. No. The aim is that the will, of which every man is a complete specimen, nay, is the very will itself, should turn whither it needs to turn, that the man himself, the union of thought and will, should perceive what this will is, and what horrors it contains, that he should show the reflection of himself in his own deeds, in the abomination of them. The state, which is wholly concerned with the general welfare, checks the manifestation of the bad will, but in no wise checks the will itself. The attempt would be impossible. It is because the state checks the manifestation of his will that a man very seldom sees the whole abomination of his nature in the mirror of his deeds. Or does the reader actually suppose there are no people in the world as bad as Robespierre, Napoleon, or other murderers? Does he fail to see that there are many who would act like them if only they could? Many a criminal dies more quietly on the scaffold than many a non-criminal in the arms of his family. The one has perceived what his will is and has discarded it. The other has not been able to discard it, because he has never been able to perceive what it is. The aim of the state is to produce a fool's paradise, and this is in direct conflict with the true aim of life, namely, to attain a knowledge of what the will, in its horrible nature, really. Napoleon was not really worse than many, not to say most, men. He was possessed of the very ordinary egoism that seeks its welfare at the expense of others. And what distinguished him was merely the greater power he had of satisfying his will, and greater intelligence, reason, and courage, added to which, chance gave him a favorable scope for his operations. By means of all this he did for his egoism what 1,000 other men would like to do for theirs, but cannot. Every feeble lad who by little acts of villainy gains a small advantage for himself by putting others to some disadvantage, although it may be equally small, is just as bad as Napoleon. Those who fancy that retribution comes after death would demand that Napoleon should by unutterable torments pay the penalty for all the numberless calamities that he caused. But he is no more culpable than all those who possess the same will, unaccompanied by the same power. The circumstance that in his case this extraordinary power was added allowed him to reveal the whole wickedness of the human will, and the sufferings of his age, as the necessary obverse of the medal, reveal the misery which is inextricably bound up with this bad will. It is the general manipulation of this will that constitutes the world. But it is precisely that it should be understood how inextricably the will to live is bound up with, and is really one and the same as, this unspeakable misery, That is the world's aim and purpose, and it is an aim and purpose which the appearance of Napoleon did much to assist. Not to be an unmeaning fool's paradise but a tragedy, in which the will to live understands itself and yields that is the object for which the world exists. Napoleon is only an enormous mirror of the will to live. The difference between the man who causes suffering and the man who suffers it, is only phenomenal. It is all a will to live, identical with great suffering, and it is only by understanding this that the will can mend an end. What chiefly distinguishes ancient from modern times is that in ancient times, to use Napoleon's expression, it was affairs that reigned, les paroles auxiliary choses. In modern times this is not so. What I mean is that in ancient times the character of public life, of the state, and of religion, as well as of private life, was a strenuous affirmation of the will to live. In modern times it is a denial of this will, for such is the character of Christianity. But now while on the one hand that denial has suffered some abatement even in public opinion, because it is too repugnant to human character, on the other what is publicly denied is affirmed. Hence it is that we see half measures and falsehood everywhere, and that is why modern times look so small beside antiquity. The structure of human society is like a pendulum swinging between two impulses, two evils in polar opposition, despotism and anarchy. The further it gets from the one, the nearer it approaches the other. From this the reader might hit on the thought that if it were exactly midway between the two, it would be right. Far from it. For these two evils are by no means equally bad and dangerous. The former is incomparably less to be feared, its ills exist in the main only as possibilities, and if they come at all it is only one among millions that they touch. But, with anarchy, possibility and actuality are inseparable, its blows fall on every man every day. Therefore every constitution should be a nearer approach to a despotism than to anarchy, nay, it must contain a small possibility of despotism.